Yes. We're good to go. Thank you everyone for coming today. We're going to begin with a short video and then we'll kick off the conversation. Screen share. For some reason, it's not letting me do it. We love a technical difficulty. Okay, there we go. Screen share. Oops. I have to double.
तेरा पिंजरा जंगल खाना किवें मिठू बजाना तेरा पिंजरा ओ तेरा सुख जाना विच चोरी दाना किवें मिठू बजाना तेरा पिंजरा ओ तेरा पिंजरा जंगल खाना किवें मिठू बजाना तेरा पिंजरा ओ तेरा सुख जाना विच चोरी दाना किवें मिठू बजाना तेरा freedom freedom
That was courtesy of Anupama Rao for showing us that video, an example of lived history. Oh, actually, just gotta make sure we're in gallery view. Yes, okay. An example of lived history to kick off today's conversation about academia and the institution and pedagogy. And that video was a dub mix and a visual commentary based on the chant by the JNU students in New Delhi and student protests a few years ago against Hindu nationalism. And welcome everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Emma Scheinbaum. I am the Communications and Development Coordinator of the Department of History at Columbia University, and together with Syed Islam, who will introduce herself shortly, we want to thank the Department of History and the Committee on Inclusion and Diversity, and Adam Costo, chair of the department, and the support of the university for allowing this panel series to be possible. And this conversation will revolve around the expansive notion of what it means to teach history and the institutional dynamics of the field. Many leaders in finance and government are coming from the same 10 to 12 schools, resulting in the reproduction of privilege among the elite. Much needs to change to expand pedagogy and access to knowledge. There are major gender racial disparities in higher education, including within the history field. Our intention today is to discuss institutional impact on learning pedagogy, how one's own identities and backgrounds shape approaches to teaching history, and whatever related topics that organically arise today in conversation. And today, our panelists, we're very excited. They each study different periods, have different institutions, different historical interests, and all study different fields. And now, Saida, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Emma. My name is Saida Islam, and I'm the Faculty Affairs Coordinator here at the History Department. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our panelists today. We have Anupama Rao, and she is an Associate Professor of History. She is also a professor of history and MESAAS with a regional focus on South Asia. She's interested in questions of social difference, inequality, and increasingly global urbanism. Broad interest as well in political thought. Our next panelist is Frank Guridy. He's an associate professor in the Columbia History Department who specializes in sport history, urban history, and the history of the African diaspora in the Americas. Luz Colpa is a doctoral student in African history in the Columbia History Department. Her interests include the history of household, family, gender, and racialization in 20th century West Africa and late imperial France. Her research is centered on interracial, transnational, and intercultural marriage in the French-speaking world. Rhiannon Stevens is an associate professor in the Columbia History Department. She specializes in the history of pre-colonial and early colonial East Africa from the late first millennium CE through this 20th century. Johanna Fernandez is an associate professor of history at Baruch College of the University of New York, where she teaches 20th century US history, the history of social movements, and the political economy of American cities. She is the author of The Young Lords, A Radical History. In 2016, her suit against the NYPD for failure to grant her FOIL request led to the recovery of the lost handshoe files, the largest repository of police records. Over 1 million surveillance records of New Yorkers include those of the NYPD surveillance of Malcolm X. She is a graduate of Columbia's History Department PhD program. And just a quick note to also add about Frank. He's also faculty in recently formed African American and African Diaspora Studies Department.
Just trying to be funny, but I am. That's true.
Well, it's important to add that, so thank you for that. I will go ahead and kick off the first question here. This question is, I'd like to start with Luz. What brought you to your studies, and how do you connect your studies in history to the reality of our current moment?
Thank you so much, everyone, for having me, and thank you, Emma and Saida, for organizing this. Everyone can hear me, right? Okay, perfect. I came to the study of history really by accident. I was an English major who had too many credits. And so I needed to sort of fill out my curriculum as a BA, and thought that history was something that I would be good at and I would be interested in. I came to my specific topic while doing an MA in France and living in the African students' residence, and was really captured by these histories of students like me who had come to study in Paris in the 1950s. I believe that the connections that you can make to my field of study, really to African history and the impact that the transatlantic slave trade has had on most of the world, but particularly the United States, being a member of the diaspora, but also thinking about how that history is all of our histories now and how we're really coming to reckon with it. And finally, really my specific topic of study, thinking about being a first generation student and working on histories of immigration and migration, working on histories of social formation and how people define themselves and how governments define them, I think is particularly relevant in this current era where we're thinking about what it means to be an American, what it means to be an immigrant, and what it means to exist within a nation state.
Thank you. And I just have a follow-up question here. You know, in our previous conversations, you mentioned, well, before I get into that, I guess my second question is, what frames your understanding of history and what informs your pedagogy? And I also wanted you to touch on one of our earlier conversations about how you address your students when you first begin your class.
So what frames my pedagogy is I spent 2 years in Azerbaijan as a Peace Corps volunteer. And so I had about 10 weeks of teacher training, which was a really great opportunity because a lot of people don't get that opportunity to do teacher training. And I was really brought into the idea of a student-centered classroom. And so I am really lucky in that I get to teach in my field. I have quite a few undergraduate students who come in looking for what we call at Columbia Global Core. It's an elective that allows the students to go beyond sort of the Western curriculum, but that means I get economics students, I get science students, it's a mixed bag. And so how I frame the class is, this is a class about history. That means you're going to learn to write. That means you're going to learn to read critically. And that means that you're going to learn to think about the world. What can I do to help you? For some students, it's very specific. I had a meeting with a student who really wanted to learn about oral history methodology. And I was like, okay, these are the sources I can give you. I have students who just want to learn to write an essay. I have students who just want to get through the course. And for me, it's important to meet all their needs. And that's really kind of the center of my pedagogical practice. It's about them and meeting them where they are and understanding that that's my job as an educator.
Thank you so much. I'd like to open the question to whoever would like to answer it next.
What frames your understanding?
What brought you to your studies, and how do you connect your studies in history to the reality of our current moment? And then the follow-up question about what frames your understanding of history and what informs your pedagogy. I know it's a loaded question, but I'll pick on Frank because he's right underneath Luz's box there.
Sure. Thanks, Emma and Saida, for yet again organizing this conversation, another session of the conversation series. And it's great to talk about history pedagogy at a time when, certainly in recent memory, I've never seen I haven't seen an interest in history in the public sphere in the way we've seen it. Certainly over the last year with the debates and the struggles around monuments. The fierce debates around the 1619 project. So this is a good time to talk about history pedagogy and its importance. So I got into history, not from taking classes in a history department. As an undergraduate, the history I was getting was from a political scientist, political theorist who was kind of, I think, anchored in what we would have seen now as sort of subaltern studies, South Asian subaltern studies. Naeem Inatullah was a Pakistani-American political scientist, and I happened to have this class that sounded really boring, Problems in International Political Economy or something like that. But it happened during the Gulf War of 1990. And it was in that moment when I saw him frame what was going on with the US war against Iraq at the time, around the history of US and European imperialism in the Middle East and in South Asia, right? We will also talk about South Asia that semester. So that, in order to understand what was going on then, we had to understand the history of the mandate system. In order to understand that, we had to read Edward Said's Orientalism. We read Francis Hutchings' The Illusion of Permanence. We read Ngugi wa Thiong'o's, this is a novel, Petals of Blood, right? I learned history from him. I learned history from Horace Campbell, who was a radical Black Marxist political scientist, because when I took the one history class at my undergraduate institution, I was utterly bored and I disidentified with it actively because it portrayed US history as a sort of onward march of democracy with a few hiccups on the road, Native American dispossession, slavery, et cetera, and so on. That form of history did not speak to me. But this history that Naeem taught, and then eventually Horace taught, did, even though it wasn't the history of my community per se, somehow it stuck with me that history becomes important to engage in contemporary political and struggles of the time. And around that time, it was around the Gulf War, and also I think in Black communities, the rediscovery of Malcolm X. I'm dating myself here, 1989, 90, 91, 92. There's a series of discussions about Black studies, Black history accompanying the Malcolm X craze of the time. So, I think, for me, like many of us, I got into history through an amazing instructor, an amazing professor. But I think the lessons that I got from those instructors in particular, and then afterwards in graduate school, though less so in graduate school, I would say, was that history can have a contemporary resonance, that harnessing historical knowledge to address inequities and imperialism in the present was useful and productive and important. So by the time I actually started studying American history or US history, the Caribbean history, I sort of came into history through the history of subaltern studies, radical international political economy, circa 1990.
Can I add to Frank's, just, he brought up South Asian studies, but I think also what he said that, we're also really framed and formed by our moments. So the moment of the Gulf War, I remember as an undergrad, this was the moment of South African divestment. And these were profound, and we began with that video of the JNU students, and in a sense taking political and public pedagogy out into the world, but also being shaped by the world and bringing those questions back into the academic space. And if one had the kinds of faculty that, Frank is mentioning, I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, so that was a very different kind of a space, but it was also the moment of Orientalism. It was the moment of subaltern studies, and it was really the moment of a kind of bringing together of what was happening in the world outside, a kind of remaking, not just knowledge, but bringing a kind of public purpose to bear on the ways in which you thought about public transformation on the one hand. Second, really experiencing the power of US colonialism for me, speaking of the Gulf War and then the War on Terror. And the fact that, the students that we teach today are framed by a moment of permanent war. Right? That's the situation that we live in. And so I think this really matters, sort of the world inside and outside the academy. And there was a very weird way in which those things were coming together. They always do. But one was very much shaped, and I'm dating myself too. This is, mid to late 80s and so on. But I think one was shaped by that. The second thing that I briefly want to say before coming into the question of the academy and historical training and so on, I think personal kind of biographies or autobiographies in some sense. And I only mention this because I came to the US at the age of 10. I came from a kind of conservative upper caste family. Very techno-oriented. So even to this day, nobody quite knows what I do in my family, but one was shaped by that kind of technological Nehruvian moment. And then I grew up on the south side of Chicago. And I went to public high school. I went to Michelle Obama's high school some years after her. And that was a profound, one was profoundly shaped by that. This was a multiracial public magnet high school. And this was a space where I think one felt held, one felt embraced. I mean, we're talking about the politics of the classroom, what shapes the students who come into the space of our classrooms. And to be shaped by a kind of high school formation, or to be shaped by an intellectual formation where racialization was sort of on the table. One also was not in a white space, if I can put it that way. This was truly a kind of multiracial space that I think had a very profound effect on the kinds of questions that one asked and the ways in which one thought about the academy and the world outside. I'll just very briefly, I know we're all keeping to about 2 minutes. I also didn't come into history at all. I was very drawn to anthropology. I was drawn to questions of social practice, of everyday life, and sort of really trying to understand the social question. What forms collectives? How do people come together? What are practices of inclusion and exclusion? And I think history for me posed that kind of a conundrum of how do these things come to be? And so I was always, I think, sort of drawn to the question of structuring structures, maybe questions of economy and capital in that sense, sort of unseen forces, if you will, but also how concepts have historical lives.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Anu. Johanna, would you like to share next?
Sure, thank you so very much for the invitation. So I did say yesterday that historians are not good about talking about their personal lives, but here we go. I hadn't even thought of answering this question. I was going to go immediately into approaches to history, but I'll attempt to answer the question about how I came to history. I too was not a history person in college. I studied literature. And in retrospect, I studied literature because English is my second language. Even though I was born here, my parents don't speak English. So literature was an attempt to master the English language. in a society where to speak a foreign language is to be a child of a lesser God. I also went to public schools in the Bronx, and I landed at Brown University, which is one of the most elite and least cosmopolitan Ivy Leagues, contrary to popular belief, where the Kennedys studied. And so the issue of class for me was front and center, especially because Brown was need aware at the time that I was accepted, which means or meant that Brown accepted students based on their ability to pay. It was the last Ivy League that went need blind. And we were part of the first experiment of a need blind class. There was a big controversy on campus about this. The admissions officers, which did this without the permission of the president and the board, got fired. And this amplified an issue on campus precisely at the moment when there was a conversation in American society about affirmative action that was very racialized. So I formed part of an organization or coalition called Students for Aid and Minority Admission, which literally occupied University Hall. It was the largest student movement of the 1990s. Over 1,000 students occupied University Hall over this issue of lack of democracy in admissions at this ruling class institution. And at around that time, I took my first history class with Bill McLaughlin, Social and Intellectual History of the United States to the Civil War. And I was just flabbergasted at how education, knowledge, history can help us make sense of the world around us. It helped me understand the Protestant ethic, the religious, overly religious characteristics of American culture. It was just a fascinating class, and I ultimately decided to study history in graduate school because I wanted to understand social problems. And I felt that history, as Malcolm X says, best equips the individual with tools necessary to understand social problems. So I came to history at a moment when I was becoming politicized in a very explicit way, at a moment when I was trying to understand the social, economic, and class structure of American society. How could a place like Brown exist alongside of the savage inequality of the public schools where I studied in the Bronx? And here we are, many, many, many moons later. This was also, by the way, just following up on what Professor Rao mentioned, this was also the moment of the Rodney King riots in the early 90s. So that was also informing what was going on in college, in the college campuses. And there was a sense that there was a disconnection between what happened in this very elite institution and the reality lived by the majority of people in American society. But I remember reading Mike Davis, who was talking about the LA riots as bread riots. We were reading Barbara Field's Race, Slavery, and Ideology, or Slavery, Race, and Ideology in the United States of America, Manning Marable's Race, Reform, and Rebellion, and an enormous amount of reading on ideology. I was also very interested in modern culture and media, which was the heavy theory major at Brown. And it transformed my life. I think the takeaway for me in this period was the profound power of study to help us understand the world around us, and to help the profound impact that education has, because it challenges what we assume about the world.
Thank you. That was very powerful. And I'd like to, last but definitely not least, Rhiannon, to tell us a little bit about what brought you to your studies and how do you connect your studies in history to the reality of our current moment?
Thank you. And thank you really to Saida and Emma for organizing this event and all the other events that you've done. It's been a real breath of fresh air for the history department at Columbia. And I really appreciate all the work that you've put into it. So I grew up in the UK, and in South Wales in a rural area, so a slightly different context to the rest of the panelists. But what brought me to African history was that in my last year of high school, we had a replacement teacher covering a maternity leave for the history class, and it was a teacher from South Africa who came and who taught us about decolonization in Africa. And it sort of, I already knew that I wanted to study history in college, but it made clear to me that I wanted to study African history. And so I went to one of the few places in the UK where it was possible to do that. And I did a degree in Swahili and African history, which set me on my path to East Africa. But most of the history that was taught, even at South, so I did my degree, was colonial history. And I was really interested in African history outside of European engagement, and the sort of the very heavy focus in the UK on Britain's experience in Africa and understanding Africa through that colonial narrative. And so I went to grad school at Northwestern because it wasn't possible to do a PhD that focused on pre-colonial history outside of the transatlantic slave trade in the UK. And I was thinking about the Anu and Frank in particular, and your responses talking about how you came to history through other disciplines. And in some ways, I got to other disciplines through history, that because I was interested in pre-colonial history and because the archives, in the sense that historians tend to think of them, don't exist, that I turned to linguistics and to anthropology and archaeology as well. And so I take a very interdisciplinary approach to my work. So thinking about how it connects to the current moment, and as a sort of a transplant to the US, and thinking about African history in the US context, it seems to me that US history is inextricably linked with African history through the, as Luz was mentioning, through the Atlantic slave trade, and through the ways in which racist ideas about Africa and Africans have continued to be used to justify the treatment of African Americans. And so, for example, when a statue of a Confederate soldier was erected at the University of Mississippi in 1906, they quoted during the unveiling from a piece written by the historian Charles Francis Adams in 1906, and he had actually been the president of the American Historical Association in 1901. So the sort of, it's worth as historians paying attention to the racist history of our own institutions as well. But so Adams wrote a piece about his travels to Sudan in the very beginning of the 20th century. And what he wrote is so racist that it doesn't bear quoting, but it was quoted at length to justify the end of Reconstruction and the imposition of Jim Crow, and the sort of the justification in the South for the Civil War. And as Frank mentioned, the 1619 project, the opposition to that, although couched in slightly more nuanced terms, the kinds of things that Tom Cotton was saying about it invoke very similar ideas about slavery, and that in some ways it was they called it a necessary evil, but this idea of uplift somehow being involved in that. And that's not, it's also not limited to the US. Just very recently in the UK, there's also debates about statues and monuments, with the toppling of a statue of a slave trader in Bristol. And the debate about that, especially on the right, is very much about invoking the heroes of imperialism, people who have, the blood of many people on their hands and who are explicitly evoked by cabinet ministers as heroes today. And, for me, really, it's the sense that Africans in that interpretation are always framed as not agents of their own history, and that they have to be saved, or they have to be, civilized or uplifted, and that imperialism was thus a good thing, right? Rather than the really violent and oppressive reality that it was. And so for me, teaching not just African history, but pre-colonial African history in particular is really important in countering that narrative, and educating people, not just about, the fact that there were empires in Africa as there were elsewhere, but also that just about the complexity and the diversity of political, social, economic, and gender ideas on the continent dating back over a millennia. Yeah.
Thank you.
Could I just add to something that Rhiannon mentioned, which was the question of sort of historians and their relationship to projects of imperialism, but also bearing in mind things like the Civil War and Reconstruction and so on. We sit at the home of the Dunning School, and I think it's very, very important to think through that particular history as well, right? So the Columbia History Department was front and center in challenging, and just think about the fact that, I think it's 1915 that Du Bois writes what is going to end up being the 1935 magnum opus, Black Reconstruction. And it is going to be the last piece by an African-American historian that's published in the AHR, the Fields, our Fields Journal, until the 1980s, when John Hope Franklin again writes about Reconstruction. So this question of sort of repetition and history and the extent to which debates about Reconstruction and Jim Crow are being replayed on our public stage, I think is noteworthy, but as well, the kind of the awkward history of the institutions where we study and work and so forth, that, on the one hand, I think as Johanna was saying, Brown, University of Chicago, deep, institutions that are sitting in deeply segregated neighborhoods with extraordinary histories of spatial segregation and so forth, but also spaces that open up and kind of emancipate thought. And then we also have this other awkward history to our institutions and our departmental cultures, and kind of balancing that kind of paradox, that contradiction, I think is also really important, or it poses a kind of conundrum for all of us.
Definitely. Thank you for that note. And thank you all for sharing that. And I want to remind all of the attendees, whether you're live streaming or you're in the Zoom, please submit your relevant questions to what we're talking about, and we'll be happy to get to as many as we can. And as we're talking about the institution's impact or relationship with public history and how historians become a part of that, I am also very interested in hearing what each of you thinks about what is critical in a history major program, in your opinion. I can start putting someone on the spot, but if anyone wants to begin, they can.
I can go first just to continue on from what I was saying. But for me, I think one thing that's really critical is learning about, in the US, is learning about people and places outside of the US and outside of Western Europe. And also outside of the West relationship with those places. And so, you know, as a pre-colonialist, I sort of talk about this a lot, but I do think it's really important, I mean, both to understand them in that context of that relationship, because it's so enduring and so imbalanced, but I do also think learning about them outside of that relationship and enables us to think differently about the past and about the possibilities of the future by thinking differently about the past. And I also think it's important to learn that we can learn history from sources other than written national archives, that oral history, that oral traditions, that art, archaeology, that, you know, personal archives, not just official archives, can give us a vast amount of insight into the past, and sharing that with our students, I also think is really fundamental, that they can get a different perspective on what it means to be human in the end, right? Because that's a lot of what we're teaching, and so taking that much more diverse approach alongside teaching US history, which obviously is essential.
Thank you, Rhiannon, for answering that. For the sake of time, I'd like to move on to the next question. This is sort of it's a loaded question, but it's pretty straightforward. I'd like to start with Anu. In your experience, does the historical canon seem to mark an institutional comfort zone? How, well, I guess I want to jump into going against the norm of how history is discussed. Historically, the history major is white male centric. When you teach outside the norm of what a lot of folks are used to, how does this discomfort manifest itself? And how can you as an educator help address it?
It is a loaded question, and it's I think a question with many different levels and layers. So, you know, if we, and again, going back to something that Rhiannon was saying, that, you know, if the first step is to actually get people to think outside of their national history. And US history is always an exceptional history, right? I suppose, you know, everybody's history is exceptional. South Asian history has also been written in exceptional and exceptionalist ways. And part of my own challenge in thinking about anti-caste thought, thinking about Dalit politics, really thinking through the question of caste and the politics of untouchability, was to challenge that kind of reigning or governing exceptionalism, even within a historical, a geo area that was not about the US or Europe, right? So I think there are different layers of thinking about difference and inequity, and the ways in which the doing of certain kinds of national histories themselves are deeply, deeply exclusionary, and what they allow in and what they allow out. So there's that, that particular issue. And then there's the way in which I think, you know, training in history in US history departments ends up reproducing a notion of history as narrative history, right? And not as kind of conceptual or as theoretical, but really that, you know, history really ought to be narratively driven. It ought to be easily accessible. So there are many ways then in which, you know, the very training of history makes it difficult, it seems to me, for people to complicate the historical narrative, whether it's the question of the archive, what counts as an archive, but really what counts as history itself too, right? And so I think so one of the first things that one wants to do, I think in a history classroom, speaking of discomfort, is to really start pushing students to take down all of those governing conceits, right? So I will very often give students very difficult text to read right at the start. And partly it is just to kind of say, you know, we all work through a text that's difficult, but I also like to think through destabilizing people, actually altering their expectations rather than supporting it. And so in that sense, perhaps this is not the most empathetic practice of teaching. It's a kind of tough love practice of teaching, but I think this is one way to get people to think through difference and embracing otherness, and actually coming to an acceptance that understanding something does not involve inhabiting or identifying completely with the other, right? So something about the ethical project, something about thinking about responsibility and complicity also demands that you be able to experience a difficult history for which there is no resolution. Right? So one way, excuse me, I'm sorry about this. So this is, I think, also to challenge the idea that if only we got our students to understand how racist the history of the United States is, this would be different. Or that if we can work through models of kind of, you know, white guilt, right? And or the idea that, you know, we are all going to be part of a broad community of allies, that somehow all of this can be redressed. And I always like to hold open the idea that that's not the project, right? That's not, you know, we're in a classroom where there's enormous difference, there's enormous diversity of various sorts. First generation learners, socioeconomic difference, gender, sexuality, various other things. And so to maintain that difference while thinking about the project of solidarity, rather than making it easy for students to think that identification is the only way of thinking, of thinking through kind of a difficult past. And so that's a kind of, you know, it sometimes works, it doesn't work at other times, because I think it is a tough thing to come through, right? You need to come out onto the other side. And you need to think very differently, it seems to me, about politics and pedagogy. So there's that. Third, I think one can also think through one's own discomfort. I don't always talk about, in fact, I hardly ever talk about myself, you know, when I'm teaching. But I'm also acutely aware of the fact that, you know, I work on questions and issues that are that put me on the spot, right? I'm an upper caste woman working on the politics of untouchability, working on anti-caste thought. What is my position, right, through which I approach these kinds of questions? And if empathy and identification are the only modes of approaching that kind of history, I think we refuse the more difficult question, which is of responsibility, of complicity, of ethics, and whether understanding can always be equated with identification or empathy.
That was very profound. Thank you for sharing that with us, Anu. I'd like to pose a question as well to Johanna, but specifically I'd like to ask you, if you feel free to answer that question as well, but I'd also like to ask you, I just lost my, oh, there we go. How have you engaged students with current events in your classroom? So you can also answer the same question I asked Anu, but I'm really curious to hear this as well from you.
Well, of late, I've been quoting James Baldwin. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And history is literally present in all that we do. So, you know, how do I address the present? I'm kind of a tough love kind of a professor too. And I think that what we don't know is history. So we need to go back and do some serious reading. And I teach the 20th century US history survey, and I start with the Civil War, not with Reconstruction. And I spend an enormous amount of time on the Civil War and Reconstruction because they help us understand the world in which we live, even today with the rise of neo-fascist elements. And you know what? What's fascinating is that students themselves say that understanding Reconstruction and reading about the Black codes and thinking about the counter-revolution that was launched by the old planter class during Reconstruction helps them understand race and racism in America today. So I think that I'd like to answer the first question you asked, which is connected here. I think that my approach is organized around understanding the relationship between economic structures, the economy, politics, and the way people live. It's traditional, but very powerful for understanding inequality, social problems, major themes in American history. I try to intravenously administer Barbara Fields' essay whenever I can, no matter what I'm teaching. And one of the brilliant moments in that essay, which is also hilarious and students love, is when she writes, you know, some historians even are so blinded by ideology that they say that slavery was the great segregator. And her response to that is, well, if slavery had been about segregation, why not leave the Africans in Africa? Why go through the trouble of bringing them to America? Slavery is an economic institution concerned with the production of cash crops for exchange in the world market. So that kind of grounding in reality, which we do not do well in America, as we can see today, is elementary. I mean, basic scientific analysis of what's before us, the economy, the relationship between slavery and capitalism, which we don't often discuss because of anti-communism in the United States. The new imperialism of the late 19th century, another moment that I spend a lot on, which when I'm teaching American history, which gives a sense that American history is not national history. It's actually the history of the rise of the second industrial revolution domestically and around the world. Why did the the new imperialism emerge? There was a deep, long depression in the late 19th century, and the European countries, in pursuit of a way out of the long depression, decided to colonize Vietnam and all of Africa. And that connects us to the United States in the 1960s and the Vietnam War. So I think that going back to the roots, which is what radical means, I consider myself a radical historian, meaning that I want to understand the root causes of social problems, but also change over time, which is what we are in the business of doing. Understanding change over time, that's what historians do. And if we stick to the basics, in fact, that offers a really rich, fertile ground for understanding the world in which we live, using history to understand the world in which we live today. And to the question of what historians and the history program and the degree should involve and include, chattel slavery transformed the world. Yes. And the rise of capitalism as we know it, both in the Americas and in the periphery. And so that kind of history and exploration, I think, is essential to, it also produced racism and race ideology. And that kind of grounding, especially for citizens of the United States and the Americas, I think is elementary. Yes, we need to know the histories of Asia and beyond, but I think that we would be doing this country a profound service if we explained the basics, which we've been avoiding for a lifetime, yes. Right? I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Yeah, so resonant. We're just pressed for time. I wish we could all speak forever. And I want to direct this next question to Frank, but I also want to open it up to everyone. And Luz, we haven't heard from you in a bit. So I'm wondering what helps you reframe your approach to teaching history? In your experiences, what has helped you rethink your approaches?
Yeah, I have a million thoughts in response to the many wonderful things that my co-panelists have said. I'm going to try to harness them into the answer to this question in this way. So I guess I teach U.S. history here at Columbia, but my approach to U.S. history, comes from the perspective of what we would call the global South. I learned U.S. history through the history of the Caribbean, the history of the transatlantic slave trade, the histories of empire, right? Like a number of us, here, I'm sure. So, I'm compelled right now at this stage in my career by this larger effort to rewrite the history of this country. I think what we're seeing right now in many corners in academia, right, but also certainly in the larger debates around, 1619 to 1776, nonsensical report that was released at the end of the Trump administration, is a battle for what the history of this country means, right, to the 21st century America. And I think all of us who work on U.S. history, a number of us in this program have been committed to that project, for quite some time. I mean, certainly our department was instrumental in writing early history of Reconstruction, but it's also been very instrumental in the rewriting of the history of Reconstruction following the intervention of Du Bois, people like Foner and people who are with us today in the audience, right? So I'm compelled by that project right now as somebody who was raised in this country, the child of immigrants from the Caribbean, who sees a real need for us to write the history of this country differently. And I think that's what's been happening. And I think as an educator, I'm compelled by, conveying to students the excitement of that process right now, right? I think our students approach us as authorities who are going to teach them about the past. In my classes, like I'm sure a number of us do in our department and in the profession, try to instill in our students the excitement of writing history right now, right? Of reinterpreting history right now, right? Particularly in this historical moment of the pandemic, of Black Lives Matter, of the struggle against fascism in this country. That makes the project of history production important for us as scholars, but also for our students. So, that's one thought, but I have to say something else because I have to read a passage. I'm going to do something that historians normally don't do. I'm going to read a passage, but I'm not going to provide the citation because I don't want to embarrass the person I'm reading from. This is from an essay on Black history that was published very recently in a prominent history journal. It's a roundtable on Black history, and one of the scholars, the person I'm going to read from right now, I guess is a majoritarian scholar, and the other scholars in the roundtable, I guess, are scholars of color. So I'm just going to read this line right here. Whereas I assume the ideas, events, and movements we will be discussing in this roundtable are very likely integral to the personal histories and identities of my colleagues. Because I'm a white American historian, my knowledge and perspectives on this topic, Black history, are limited to research and teaching. And I read that and I cringed, because it's an expression from the majoritarian subject of empathy and allyship and disidentifying with an authoritative voice that white male historians have occupied throughout the history of the profession. But then at the same time, it presumes that the minoritized scholar, or it doesn't approach these questions for research and teaching either, right? That somehow this expression of positionality does some dangerous work. It actually reinscribes a kind of essentialism in our classroom, which I think is really problematic and dangerous, right? And it also elides the enormous contributions that historians, from Herbert Aptheker to George Lipsitz, among many others, have made to the histories of racism, slavery, and inequality in this country, right? So I think what we see happening right now in our world, in the classroom, are attempts to articulate an empathetic allyship. But what I see as problematic and as a break on real social transformation are the ways in which that reinscribes that certain people from certain backgrounds have certain knowledges and others don't, right? And I think the best of our profession shows that that's not the case necessarily. So, I mean, that's a bit of a tangent, but it's relevant to a number of the points that people have raised here. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Luz, did you want to add anything? You look like you might want to.
Yes. I've been thinking a lot about what everyone's been saying, particularly starting with Professor Guridy's idea, that quote, and Professor Rao's challenge to her students to think about their participation in history as not just empathy or empathetic allyship, but to think about it in forms of complicity, in forms of sort of morality. And I go back and forth with this with one of my friends quite a bit. I tend to try to be as kind or empathetic to my students as possible, but I also tend to experience sort of this dual nature of students taking an Introduction to African History course. I have students who are diaspora, who are either first generation from the continent, they're African American, and then I have students who are not. And it could fall into that sort of divide that I think Professor Guridy was addressing, that you have students who should be connected to their history for some reason, that we have this expectation, and that it was an expectation, honestly, that was being placed on me. And then we have students who are supposed to empathize, are supposed to be quiet and be allies. And I think the approach I've taken to it is to go back to one of the themes, which is our background outside of history and the massive amount of English courses I took, and to focus on words, to think about the way words, how all words and concepts have a history, and thinking about Professor Fernandez talking about how to be radical is to go back to the basics. So one of the things that happens when I teach Introduction to African History is that my students will inevitably, and I talk about this on the first day, you will use a word incorrectly that is incredibly pejorative. And a lot of times we'll talk about what pejorative means. And that moment is not a moment to be embarrassed. That moment is to think about how we use language. And that's one of my jobs as a teacher of history, is to make sure that you are attentive to how you use your language. And so we'll go through specifically words. I've done entire lesson plans on like 3 words and talk about how this word is related to this concept, how the concept of enslaved status is related to a concept of being a non-believer on the East African coast, and how this is wrapped up in a word, how it's wrapped up into an understanding of who's allowed to be enslaved in West Africa. And for me personally, to try to find a middle ground between the tough love approach, which I was raised with and I experienced as an undergrad and sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, and a way of thinking about how we are all I was raised Christian. We're all sinners. And how that's something that should unite us and not divide us. And if we can think about the ways in which that works around the world with the rise of chattel slavery, with capitalist institutions, thinking about our position at the university, we can begin to do what Professor Fernandez says and understand our place within the world.
Thank you for that, Luz. We have a question from the audience, and I'm going to go ahead and ask here. Outside of course content, and I'm quoting the question here. Outside of course content, I'm wondering if anyone has ideas about pedagogical techniques and practices that create a more inclusive, participatory, and less hierarchical, and perhaps even radical classroom. Some thoughts on that are, who or what defines what is radical in history or history pedagogy? Does anyone want to answer that question from the audience?
Can you repeat that question again?
Sure, it's also here. I'll paste it in the chat here as well. It says outside of course content. Emma, if you can paste it, please, while I read it. Outside of course content, I'm wondering if anyone has ideas about pedagogical techniques and practices that create a more inclusive, participatory, and less hierarchical, and perhaps even radical classroom.
Can I answer that question?
Yes, please.
And I'm going to connect this to the Dunning School. Columbia University produced the Dunning School, but the 60s also happened to the world and to the country. And what emerges is a different approach to history, history from below, right? A study of history from below, but history that's critical of the great man's interpretation of society and how things happen. And I think that what the 60s also produced, because the university was not a very democratic place, was the seminar. So the seminar is a product of social movements, essentially democratizing knowledge within the university and without. So I think that the seminar is not something that only happens in the university. It's actually happening right now in small groups around the country. Apparently there is an upsurge of reading groups domestically and around the world, where people are just reading a book and talking about it collectively. But there is something, I also don't want to throw the professors away, because there's an enormous amount of deep study that comes with what we do in our profession that can't emerge overnight. And so the role of the specialist, who's broadly trained and dynamic in their attempt to draw out debate and discussion, is important. And this gets us to the issue of pedagogy and teaching, which is not part of our training in PhD programs. You're kind of expected to figure it out. But I think we need to, as professors, remind ourselves that all the studies suggest that students learn more from discussing and working problems out than they do from us talking to them. That we need to help frame questions and offer framing analyses, but ultimately encourage debate and discussion among our students.
Absolutely. Yes, Anu, did you want to answer?
Yeah, I want to say something quickly. The other thing, though, is I want to also ask my colleagues on this panel, and this is just a comment, and then I'll come to the pedagogy question, but you know, we began by speaking about kind of empire and thinking about world and global history, but we're back to talking about the US and transforming the teaching of US history. And so I wanted to kind of, you know, and I want to kind of go back to something that Frank began with. So what does learning about the mandate system, or thinking about Orientalism, or thinking through the kind of archival work that many of us do, which is not English and speaking about words and language and so on, which is actually thinking about a kind of radical incommensurability, maybe moments where you can't translate, right? Something looks like equality, but it's not. It's dignity, or it's status, or it's, right? So what do we do? How do we bring that world into the way that we think about the US, right? So this was just something to throw open. But on the pedagogy question, you know, any work of radical pedagogy, going back to something that I think Johanna was saying as well, that this project of mass intellectuality, of democratizing education, is also a project of a kind of transference, right? Where the teacher is as radically transformed by the student as the student becoming a kind of teacher, right? So in an ideal kind of space, that's the way that really a kind of pedagogical project works. And I guess one of the things that I've been really finding is, you know, I've been doing a lot more collaborative work with my students, and trying hard in a sense to also move away from kind of things like, you know, using the essay form, or only using that as the mode by which they kind of exist and make sense and realize themselves in the world. But, you know, using things like data visualization or spatial mapping, or a number of other tools where, because I am so techno illiterate, it's actually become this very productive space where students are enthused and they teach you something. And then you're able to throw something back to them and kind of say, well, you know, now think about how an archive really works. And I agree with what Johanna was saying. I think we lose a lot if we engage in a kind of popular or a populist project that, you know, all students are teachers, or we're all kind of in this together. There is something about deep training. There is the encounter with an archive. There is the kind of serious ass time of, you know, sitting, going day in and day out and sitting in an archive and taking notes, and your hand hurts and you got to come home and they don't let you use your computer. So you've got to come home and you rewrite that thing. And, you know, then something is etched in your memory because of that process of material engagement with an archive and with your quest, in a sense, right, to make sense or to create a kind of logic of around what you're finding. But I think there are ways that one can also think about pulling students in and playing very much to their strengths and trying to work collaboratively so that they're able to work with each other and really develop something that is collaborative, that lets them let go as well of the notion that each of them is producing something competitively in an environment where they are speaking to you and impressing you, especially in the context of the institutions, you know, Columbia, Barnard, et cetera, where we are. I think to kind of radically deflate that sense of kind of entitlement and the reproduction of privilege, which also happens in the classroom, could be very powerful. It's not the only mode, but it's one way that one tries in a very particular kind of classroom context to get students to think otherwise.
Thank you, Anu. And I'm gonna pose the next question to Rhiannon and Luz and anyone else who wants to answer, but they will begin. Let's talk about the importance of looking at primary sources that go beyond the racial, gender, religious, etc. normative canon, which tends to be the patriarchal, white, Christian, hetero, Western Euro lens.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I was just listening to Anu and thinking that I've really had the experience of sitting in the archive, because for the periods that I study, there aren't archives. So, you know, the way that I do my research is that I have to create an archive by interviewing people and by collecting, I mean, in some ways sitting and transcribing words from a speaker of a language, and then going and, because I use historical linguistics, reconstructing words to proto-languages that are no longer spoken, and then trying to make sense of the intellectual motivations that people had in changing the way that they spoke about something or creating a new word. And so thinking, so in that way, it's sort of radically outside of the normative archive, right? And it's also because it's language, and it's the words that became spoken by everybody because they're the ones that were retained. It's sort of a very democratic mode of doing history. And you can also, but even within that, you can see contestation. You can see how, I'm just completing a project on people's concepts of poverty and wealth in Eastern Uganda over the last 2,000 years. And you can see contestation, like the sort of attempts to shame the poor, but also to criticize the wealthy. And so in terms of pedagogy, I try and bring some of that into the classroom as well, and to expose the students to not just the kinds of archival sources that they might more readily associate with history, but a list of reconstructed vocabulary, and have them try and think through how you can write a narrative history from that, or an image of an altarpiece from southern Nigeria, and what the depictions of gender on that altarpiece might tell us about practices in the community.
Thank you. And actually, Luz, if you wanted to add something briefly, I also have a follow-up to this.
No, that description of sitting in the archive, because I work in the 20th century, so there are in fact archives for the things I work on. It just brought it back, but also this idea that because I work on histories of gender, but more specifically histories of love. The marriages that one finds in the archives are generally not happy marriages. Those leave no trace. And to start to think about the ways in which histories on marriage, histories on emotion are written from archives that are much more concerned with divorce, with regulation. And I mean, occasionally, I'm not sure I'm allowed to do this, but I just give primary sources to my students, and I let them sit for a couple of minutes with Google Translate. Luckily, French legalese sometimes looks a lot like American legalese, and I usually have a French speaker in one section or another, and they work through them. And to talk about these ideas, to talk about how history is written, and what I'm training, what this person who grades them is training to do, has been, I found, pretty productive.
Thank you. And I wanted to talk about how we might reconcile teaching across, as an educator, your own identity or background or comfort zone. And then it comes to the question, who really has access to knowledge, and how do these disciplines form? And if Rhiannon, if you wanted to add on that, and then we can, anyone else who wanted to answer.
Yeah, sure, I can add on that. It's a big question, especially in African history, and it has been since the field was brought into majority white institutions in the 1960s in the US, because in the US, African history had long been taught in HBCUs, and research had been done by African-American scholars in those institutions. And Du Bois is also an example of a scholar who was marginalized in the field of African history. And the mainstreaming of African history led to the deliberate marginalization of those scholars and of their scholarship, both African history and also African studies more generally. And as a field or as an area of studies, it's something that our sort of institutions have been grappling with more publicly recently, and coming to terms with that history of marginalization, because it has been the case that most of the people doing research, being funded to do research and employed to teach African history have been white and continue to be white. I think that there's a gradual change, but it's a long way from happening. But also that although in the immediate aftermath of independence in Africa, there was a lot of historical scholarship produced in African universities. The crises of the 1970s and since have meant that there's just not funding for African researchers to produce the scholarship. And so that creates, real structural barriers. And thinking of archives, most of the archives for 19th and 20th century Africa are located outside of the continent, right, in Europe. And the increasing, barriers on travel and access to visas is just ever making that harder. And so I think it's something that in the classroom is really important to be upfront about that power imbalance in the production of knowledge about Africa, and not just in the communication of knowledge in the classroom and sort of reframing that and trying to think through it, but also in terms of who has been able to produce that knowledge and what that means for the kinds of histories that get written. And so then pulling that back into syllabus construction, making sure to really privilege scholarship by African scholars in particular, but also by women scholars. I teach a lot on gender, and that's also an issue in terms of thinking sort of across those divides. But I think just being honest and upfront about it is a good starting place.
Thank you for that, Rhiannon. I'd like to ask the next question to Frank. How does learning across disciplines throughout your time as a historian inform your own field?
Everywhere I have been in my teaching career, but even as a grad student, I've always had multiple affiliations. So here I'm in the history department. I'm also in the African American, African Diaspora Studies department. I had multiple affiliations, appointments in my previous job at the University of Texas, Austin, and often that is seen by even myself and colleagues as an extra burden from a service standpoint. But I've always seen it as a bonus because it institutionalized in my own career in terms of appointments the ways in which my work as a historian has always been informed by Black studies, ethnic studies, African diaspora studies models, right, which are deeply embedded in the discipline of history, but also stand outside of it, right? So to do the work on marginalized communities in this country, you have to be creative with archives. Rhiannon talked about this as a central problem in pre-colonial Africa, but it can be a problem also if you're working on U.S. history, 20th century U.S. history. One has to be really creative about archives. One has to be creative about the kinds of questions you ask when you walk into the archive. And so, I think for me, embedding my work in, like my most recent work, which is more US based, in Chicano studies, Chicana feminism, looking at obviously a lot of the debates that are happening in Black studies right now, has really helped shape the questions and that I ask myself as a historian. It also shapes the way I teach the work, right? So that means, like others, I'm not the only one who does this. When I teach in my history class, I'll teach novels, I'll teach other works that are not written by historians. Working on sport really presents really fascinating opportunities on this front so that, I can bring in things, that are in journalism or sports writing. I've been actively bringing in, visual sources and videos into my teaching as a way to get students in this digital age to be creative about archives. I think the pandemic has really made this a major problem, and who knows what's going to look like when we come out of this, if we do, in terms of how do we teach alternative archives? How do we, emphasize the importance of still doing the research that's necessary and not be enslaved to the digitized sources? Laura Putnam has written about this very eloquently in the AHR a couple of years back, and so I think. But for me, it's always been immersed in not just the histories, the historiographical debates in Black studies or Chicano studies or Latinx studies, but it's actually engaging those debates as well as they stand outside of history, so that I can, use some of the methods that those scholars and activists have used over the years, and also, center my discussion around some of those debates, not just historiographical ones.
Thank you for that, Frank. And we do have a few more questions. I'm gonna go ahead and ask a question that we received from the chat. It's similar, actually connected to, you mentioned the pandemic. So do you think with the pandemic, a non-hierarchical pedagogy that emphasizes the presupposition of equality between the instructor and the instructed is possible? How does critical pedagogy fit into teaching critical histories and theories? And I also pasted it in the chat for the panelists to see, for whoever wants to answer that. We can come back to it as well if you guys want to marinate on that question. I have another question here. It says, why do we find more emphasis on a particular subject matter or certain parts of the world seem to matter more to institutions? You'll find there's a lot of underrepresentation and very little funding available for a subject or continent. One could take it a step further and address the lack of professors of color in academia. Why is it important to have background diversity in the faculty population and a variety of course time periods / areas offered? I'm just going to open that up to whoever would like to take a stab at that.
Is there a way for us to see the question? Because there were like 5 questions in that question.
So this one is this one is in the doc, but I'll also paste it here in the chat for you guys all to see. There you go. But I see Anu and Luz kind of giving me some signals like they want to answer, or no, am I misreading the signal? But I know Anu unmuted herself, so.
I mean, just, you know, I think we should think about it. And I know that there was another question too about kind of public and private institutions and so on. I think a lot of this really does have to do, and we've been talking about inequality, we've been talking about access, inclusion and exclusion. And you know, there are really broad histories of institutional formation, but also the ways in which, again, you're asking the question, you know, why are certain topics privileged as opposed to others? Well, you know, this is partly about money. This is partly about funding. This is partly about the ways in which a small number of institutions are boundary making and boundary keeping institutions that actually decide in some sense what the dominant scholarly ideals and norms of the field are, right? And the question of kind of, you know, alternative histories, counter histories, thinking more creatively about archives, public and private archives, but also the very constitution or the creation of archives, which I think all of us have had to think through because of the work that I think all of us do as kind of heterodox historians of some sort, insurgent, call it what you will. But, you know, a lot of this really does confront in a very serious form and fashion the reproduction of knowledge and what counts as, you know, knowledge that can be reproduced, where such knowledge gets published. And maybe we've come very far from it, but, you know, I don't know, let me be the one to be slightly pessimistic. To say that, you know, I think the reproduction of that kind of inequity in both knowledge formation, but also the support for other knowledge practices are ephemeral, they are fleeting, they happen at moments of crisis, but we forget too quickly what we thought was important. So all of the many turns in history, the linguistic turn, the cultural turn, the material turn, all of these speak, you could say, if one was being slightly suspicious and critical, that all of those speak to certain moments where there is funding going to particular, you know, issues and questions that are really dominant and powerful, and that shape the kind of, you know, historical and the public and popular common sense of that moment. And I think, you know, many of the institutions that I mean, this, you know, this institution and others are part and parcel of that reproduction of entitlement and privilege. That does not mean that that is the only thing that they do, but that has, for much of their history, been what they are in the business of doing. And that tight compact then between these institutions, the production of a certain kind of elite, the inability, and I come back very importantly to something that Johanna said, the inability to think about class formation, the lack in some very profound sense of a material analysis of these roots of everyday life, especially in this country where a certain kind of liberalism is the dominant thing of our public culture, makes it impossible for us to think through this question of responsibility and the reproduction of elite formation.
Thank you.
That
And
was a wonderful answer. Would anyone else like to add to what Anu said?
Well, very quickly, another way to say all of what you've said, which is just poignant, is that universities reflect the structures of power in society. They're not above the structures of politics and power and class dynamics in society, especially Ivy League schools. And education is potentially a revolutionary tool. And that's why schools, universities are ideological state apparatuses. This is, the stuff that I learned at Brown in modern culture and media, Louis Althusser. It's actually, education is a tool that helps reproduce the dominant structures and ideas needed to reproduce the power structures in society. But there are moments when that's interrupted. And so the reason why we're having this conversation, the reason why we study Asia and Africa and Black American history and the history of Latinos is because people in this country and around the world at some point said, the world does not revolve around Europe. It is, in fact, Europe is a product of the knowledge that was produced elsewhere. And there was a demand for the university to reflect the diversity of experience and history and approaches to living and science and culture everywhere else. So to the question, why do we find more emphasis on a particular subject matter than others? Because we haven't produced the movements that are that will challenge the university and sites of education to reflect the world and reality and history as it is.
yes.
I'll just say very quickly that in the 1990s, we occupied University Hall, the one in front of Butler Hall, over the issue of ethnic studies. So the ethnic studies, the Latino studies, I can't remember what it's called now, is a product of a struggle on the ground that shamed Columbia University for being a Johnny-come-lately to the study of other peoples in the United States, marginal peoples in the United States, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. Yeah.
Thank you.
That center does amazing work, even though it's under supported by our institution, but that's another story. Can I just jump in here real fast? I mean, Joanna, I don't know others think, I think we're in one of those moments right now. I mean, the pandemic, well, certainly from last summer. And I'm very interested in seeing the ways in which, in response to the Me Too movement a couple years back, in response to heightened awareness of sexual harassment, and in response to, all the incredible, powerful movement for Black lives that's highlighted police brutality, the knee-jerk reaction of our institutions is to go back to inclusion diversity work, and I think that which then mystifies, I think, the direct solutions that could be posed to these problems, which is resources, right? And resources that are permanently placed in an institution like ours, not window dressing things that come in the guise of postdocs, or bringing somebody to consult and help us learn how to not be racist and pay them a lot of money. And that's it, right? I mean, I think that there are, looking at earlier moments of institutional responses to moments like the 90s or the 60s, like the 68 movement here at Columbia was foundational for Black studies, among other units on campus, and other experiences for students on campus. I'm struck by how limited the responses are, right, to what we've seen. And I do think what happened last summer is, at least my hope is to expose the kind of absolute limits of token inclusion diversity gestures, right? And literally put resources that fundamentally transform, at least to some degree, even our own little small world university, how knowledge is produced and who produces it, right? So that means supporting certain programs that don't get supported regularly. That means hiring permanently certain people, not bringing them in for a season, right? And institutionalizing things, or at least creating institutional spaces that really can allow for some substantive change in the university itself. I'm not talking about, let alone in the society as a whole. And I think that when you were talking about the 90s moment, it just brought me to now, right? Because I think we're in one of those moments right now.
Would anyone else? Thank you, Frank. Would anyone else like to answer? I mean,
or like give closing remarks.
On this question of the pandemic, I think the university, there's going to be a struggle in the university about what teaching is going to look like. And whether we're going to be forced as faculty to teach online. But at the same time, this Zoom insanity has really democratized conversations. I mean, I've talked to people all over the world, little groups of people who are just excited to have a conversation about the world today. So in many ways, the pandemic has isolated us, but it's brought us together in incredible ways. And I think the challenge is to use the best of the democratization of intellectual debate and discussion and education through this venue in a way that doesn't disempower faculty and the experience of education in person. So I know that this is all going to be monetized because the university was headed and has been headed in the direction of the bottom line, right? So the question of how this new venue is going to transform the world and the university is one that we need to be paying attention to, that offers tremendous opportunities, but potentially shortcomings and problems.
Would anyone else like to add any closing remarks? Because we are sadly coming to an end here. We all had such an enlightening conversation, and I learned a lot from this panel, and I am very grateful to and privileged to be able to co-moderate this history and conversation with historians monthly panel, and be able to learn from all of you amazing scholars. I'd like to thank our chair, Adam Costo, for again allowing us and really providing that space, and Frank Guridy, who from the start pushed us and believed in this vision and has been supporting these monthly webinars ever since. And I know he always has so much on his plate but never says no to us, so thank you, we appreciate that. I'd like to also I'd like to thank Johanna because, you know, you are a Columbia alum and you're a professor and an activist and out there doing such amazing work. And I remember when we first spoke, I was really hoping you say yes to join this panel. So thank you. And Luz, you gave us a perspective from a student and an educator. We learned so much from you. And Anu, I love that video that you sent us that we opened with. Thank you so much for that. And, you know, my father being from Pakistan and having a lot of roots in India and Pakistan, I really connected with that. And thank you so much for that. And Rhiannon, thank you for, you were the brains and the idea behind us even having this panel this month. So thank you for bringing it to us and for being so patient because we've been working on this for months. And I'm going to go ahead and let Emma close if you'd like, if there's anything else you'd like to say.
You really summed it up.
Wait, before you speak,
Sure.
I just have to say that y'all have brought something to the history department that has reconstructed the history department at Columbia. So Emma and Saida, I think you have to be thanked for the courage. I think part of, you know, what ultimately I want to impart my students with is the courage to push us forward with an understanding of the past. And y'all have done something that's like breaking a commandment at Columbia University and the history department. Imagine bringing people together to talk about what we do and challenges we face. So it's transformed 20 years out my relationship to the department. So thank you.
That means so much. We really, really appreciate all of you for coming here and giving your time today. And we will be back hopefully in February for another panel. So stay tuned for that. And thank you all for being here.
Everyone.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Stay safe.
Everyone.